Living in the outback of Australia has its perks. The space, the tranquility, the fact that you can sort things out at your own pace without a neighbor peering over the fence all the time. But it also has its downsides, and one of them is that, every now and then, you end up having to deal with people who simply don't understand boundaries. My property is a few kilometers from the nearest town, a well-equipped farm with everything I need to live independently. This includes my own water supply system. Out here, you can't rely on government infrastructure like you can in the big cities, so those of us in the outback usually have our own rainwater tanks and pumping systems. If you don't take good care of your supply, you can run dry pretty quickly, especially in summer. And that's exactly why my neighbor, the self-proclaimed queen of the area, became a problem. From the day she moved into the property next door, it was clear she was the kind of person who thinks everything around her exists to serve her. Her name wasn't Karen, but there wasn't a name that suited her better. She was the perfect definition of a bogan Karen. If you've ever met one, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A loud, intrusive woman who spoke as if she owned the place and had zero consideration for anyone but herself. At first I tried to keep things friendly. I'm the type who believes it's good to have a good relationship with neighbors, especially in the outback, where people usually help each other out. But Karen clearly didn't think the same way. From the first few days, I noticed she had no respect for other people's space. First came the comment. She made a point of saying that my fence cut off her view, as if my property existed for her aesthetic comfort. Then came the complaints about the noise from my equipment. Nothing like parties or loud music, just basic farm stuff like an ATV, or the generator running now and then. But the worst started when she began treating my resources as if they were hers. At first, it was small, unsolicited loan. One day I noticed tire tracks leading to my shed, but I didn't think much of it. Then I realized that some tools I usually keep stored in the shed were out of place. Since I had workers on the property, I thought it might be something to do with them, so I just reorganized things. But then came the first big red flag. My water bill shot up out of nowhere. Here in the outback, each property has its own recorded usage, since there's no central supply like in the cities. I know my water consumption very well, and I know exactly how much water I use in a normal month. So when I realized that the bill had nearly doubled with no apparent explanation, I knew something was wrong. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a leak? A problem with the underground pipes? I spent a weekend checking every part of my system, looking for any cracks in the pipes or faults in the pump, but everything was in perfect condition. It was only after eliminating all other possibilities that I began to suspect the one person in the area who seemed to have no limit. So, on a hot morning, I decided to do a test. I noted the reading on my water meter early before the sun came up. Then I turned off all the taps in the house and went about my day. I returned in the late afternoon to check the meter again. And there it was, an absurd amount of water used, even though I hadn't used a single drop during the day. It wasn't a leak. Someone was stealing my water, and I already had a very strong suspicion of who it was. I spent the night lying in bed, but sleep was out of the question. My mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Who was stealing my water? How had no one noticed this before? And most importantly, how long had this been going on? The idea that someone had simply tapped into my supply system, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, left me uneasy. I knew I needed to find out who the culprit was before taking any action. As soon as the sun began to rise, I put on my boots and went out to investigate. The morning air was still fresh, and the only sounds were the birds singing and the sound of my cattle's hooves lazily moving through the pasture. But I wasn't paying attention to any of that. My focus was on the supply network. I followed the main pipeline, checking every connection, every junction, every point where the water was distributed. My farm was well organized, and I knew every pipe buried there, so if something was off, I would notice, and it didn't take long to find it. There, in the middle of nowhere, a new connection had been made. The main pipe, which was supposed to carry water only to my facilities, now had an improvised diversion leading straight out of my property, and its destination left no doubts. The clandestine pipeline went directly to Karen's house. I stood there for a moment looking at that grotesque work. It was a bodge job made with duct tape, an old hose, and low-quality fittings, the kind that anyone who actually knows plumbing would never use. In other words, this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was outright theft. Karen had literally tapped into my supply line and was diverting my water as if it were her right. I took a deep breath, trying to contain my anger. I wanted to march over to her house right then and there, knock on her door, and throw the truth in her face. But I knew that wouldn't do any good. Karen wasn't the type of person to admit to being wrong. She would always have some excuse, always try to turn the situation around and make me look like the villain of the story. If I confronted her without enough evidence, she would simply deny everything. So I decided to do something different. I went home, grabbed my phone, and took several photos of the illegal connection, capturing all the details: the makeshift hose, the grotesque way it was attached to my system, the exact direction the water was being diverted. Now, if Karen tried to deny it, I had evidence. But I wanted more than that. I wanted to catch her red-handed. That's when I had a simple but effective idea. I would completely shut down my pumping system and wait to see what would happen. If Karen was really stealing my water, she would immediately notice that her supply had stopped. And knowing her personality, I knew she wouldn't stay quiet. So that's exactly what I did. I walked over to the main pump, turned off the entire system, and waited. I went up to the porch, grabbed a beer, and sat comfortably, watching the dirt road that led to my property. The sun was already high in the sky, and the farm was quiet. For a while, nothing happened. Then, less than 2 hours later, I heard the phone ring. I picked up my phone and looked at the name on the screen. It was Karen. I smiled to myself and simply ignored the call. Just a few minutes later, there she was. I saw through the window when Karen's figure appeared on the dirt path, marching towards me like an enraged bull. Her steps were quick, her shoulders tense, and even from afar I could tell she was furious. It didn't take long for her to reach my porch, huffing with anger. She didn't even try to disguise her frustration. "There's something wrong with your water," she shot, not even bothering to say hello or ask if I was busy. I just stood there, arms crossed, pretending to be confused. "Oh, really? How do you know?" She hesitated for a moment, and I could see the momentary panic in her eyes. It was a brief lapse, but it was there. She realized she had said too much. But Karen, being Karen, quickly recovered. "Because my water has stopped working." I left an uncomfortable silence fill the air between us, just watching the audacity of that woman. "Oh, I see. And how exactly is that my problem?" Her face turned red immediately. "I know you control the supply, so can you fix this already?" She was so used to getting what she wanted, so used to bossing others around, that she didn't even try to deny it. I had to stifle a laugh. She really believed that I would just accept what she did and turn the water back on as if nothing had happened. But she was about to find out that's not how things worked with me. I stood on the porch, watching Karen with my arms crossed, as she glared at me with an expression of pure impatience. The fact that she wasn't even trying to hide that she was using my water impressed and irritated me at the same time. She didn't come to apologize, didn't come to try and explain. She came to demand that I solve her problem. "So? Are you going to fix this or not?" she insisted, stamping her foot on the ground like a child who didn't get what they wanted. I tilted my head slightly to the side, as if I were really pondering her question. "Well, I still don't understand what exactly your problem is." She let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes. "My problem is that the water in my house has stopped working." "I see. And how does that involve me?" Her hesitation lasted only a second, but I saw it. She realized she had said too much. But like every good Karen, instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Don't pretend you don't know. You have an entire farm with a giant water system. It's obvious that something in your system is affecting my supply." I crossed my arms, pretending to think. "So you're telling me that if my water stops, yours stops too?" She opened her mouth to respond, but realized the trap in my question. It was like watching a critical error happen live. Her gaze went vacant for a second, and then she tried to change tactics. "Look, I don't want to fight. I just want you to turn the water back on. This is all being ridiculous." "Oh, so now it was ridiculous?" I leaned against the door frame and stared at her. "Karen, you hooked up an illegal pipe to my supply and have been stealing my water for who knows how long. And now you want me to pretend nothing happened and just turn the pump back on for you?" She made a face as if I had just said the most absurd thing in the world. "Stealing? Oh my God, stop exaggerating." I let out a short laugh. "Oh, so how would you call this?" she huffed. "It's not like I'm hurting you. You have plenty of water. I just needed to use a bit because my tank is low." "A bit, Karen? My bill has doubled." "Oh, come on, you're a farmer. It doesn't make a difference to you." There it was, the classic argument of every Karen. If you have something in excess, then it's your obligation to share. Karen looked at me as if I were the selfish one in the story, as if I were a monster for not wanting to pay for her water. She really thought her need was justification enough to simply hook up a pipe and siphon a resource that didn't belong to her. And the worst part? She didn't even seem remotely regretful. I could have ended the conversation there. I could have said I would call the police. I could have issued an ultimatum. But her reaction made me change my mind. "So let me see if I understand," I continued, keeping a calm and calculated tone. "You secretly connected to my pipeline, used my water for weeks without notifying me, increased my bill, and now you're angry because I turned off the pump?" She huffed and crossed her arms. "You're being childish." "No, Karen. Childish is taking something that isn't yours and then playing the victim when caught red-handed." She rolled her eyes and threw her hands up. "My God, what a drama! If it was such a problem, you could have told me earlier." I stifled a laugh. "So now it's my fault because I took so long to find out you were stealing?" She opened her mouth but fell silent midway through the sentence. For the first time since this argument started, she didn't know what to say. The truth is, she never expected me to find out. In her perfect world, I would just pay the bills and never notice a thing. Now that she had been caught, she was trying any argument to turn the situation around. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I let out a long sigh and stared at her. "Look, Karen, I could just call the police right now." Her eyes widened. "What?" "Yes. You know this is a crime, right? Illegal water diversion. I have photos of the clandestine pipe, the connection you made, the hose. If I want, I can take this to the authorities and make you pay a lot more than a water bill." She paled, and I saw fear emerge behind her arrogant expression. But then, in a last-ditch effort to rid herself of the guilt, she tried to play the victim. "Please, I was just trying to solve a problem. You know how dry the summers are here. I just needed a bit of help, and you couldn't just have asked?" She looked away. She knew that if she had asked, the answer would have been no. "I'll give you a chance," I continued. "You can sort this out now. Go over there, disconnect that ridiculous pipe, and make sure this never happens again." She crossed her arms again. "And what if I don't do that?" I shrugged. "Then the water stays off." Her face turned red with anger. "You can't do that." "Of course I can. I literally already have." She shot me a glare but saw there was no way out. If she didn't remove the makeshift setup, she would be completely without water. If she called a plumber, the situation would be exposed, and she would probably be embarrassed in the community. Without saying anything more, she turned sharply and marched back home, stomping down the dirt road. I knew she wouldn't give up that easily. But what Karen didn't know was that I already had a much better plan to deal with this. Karen marched back home with heavy steps, huffing with rage like a bull about to charge. It was obvious she wasn't going to accept the situation so easily. But for the first time, she found herself with no way out. If she didn't remove that makeshift setup, she would be without water. If she tried to reconnect, I would notice. And if she called a plumber, the entire town would find out what she had done. But I knew Karen well enough to know she wouldn't give up that easily. I gave her the rest of the day to think, waiting to see what her next move would be. Early in the evening, I peeked at her house from my porch. The lights were on, but there was no movement outside. No plumber had arrived, no attempt to undo the diversion. I knew what that meant. She was waiting for me to give in. Deep down, Karen truly believed I wouldn't have the guts to keep the water off for long. Maybe she thought I would feel sorry for her, that the next day I would be filled with remorse and turn everything back on without asking for anything. Only she picked the wrong person to test. The next morning, I went to the shed and grabbed my tools. If Karen wanted to see how far I would go, then I would show her exactly what I was capable of. I walked to the point where the diversion was connected to my plumbing and started to dismantle it. But instead of just disconnecting and covering the hole, I had a better idea. I took a new PVC pipe, made some adjustments, and instead of blocking the water flow, I redirected the entire supply back to my main reservoir. Now, all the water that was being stolen would be redirected to me. And Karen? Well, she would remain without a single drop. The most interesting detail was that the diversion now looked functional. If someone looked quickly, they would see that the pipe still led to Karen's property. But in reality, nothing was going there anymore. She would have to call someone to fix it, and when she did, she would discover the extent of the damage she had caused to herself. I went back home and sat on the porch, waiting. It didn't take long. Before noon, Karen showed up again. This time, however, she didn't come stomping and shouting. She stopped at the entrance to my property and stood there, hesitating. Something had changed. When she finally decided to approach, her voice was much more controlled than before. "Hey, I think there's still something wrong." I crossed my arms and feigned curiosity. "Oh, really? What happened?" She took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. "I tried to mess with the plumbing, but the water didn't come back." I tried to suppress a smile. "How strange. Must be a problem with your plumbing." She looked at me for a moment, assessing my words. She knew I was up to something, but she couldn't prove it. "You didn't do anything, did you?" "Me? Of course not. I just turned off what was going to me. What happens on your side of the fence isn't my problem." Her jaw clenched. She realized the play. She was now completely trapped. With no working plumbing, no way to fix it without exposing her own scam. If she called a plumber, she would have to explain how the hell her house was connected to my farm. She narrowed her eyes, trying to think of something. "Can you please turn the water back on?" The word please almost made me laugh, but it was too late to play nice. "Sorry, Karen. My farm system is no longer available for external use." She clenched her fists but tried to keep her tone neutral. "So, what do you suggest I do?" I shrugged. "Well, you can dig a well. You can install new piping legally connected to the city supply. You can buy a tank and pay for water transport. There are plenty of options." Her face twisted in frustration. She knew any of those options would cost a fortune. Maintaining a private supply in the countryside isn't cheap. If she wanted to solve the problem the right way, she would have to shell out thousands. She opened her mouth to retort but stopped halfway. For the first time, Karen realized she had lost. I expected her to throw another tantrum, to shout, to threaten, but instead she simply turned her back and went home. But I knew the story wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type of person to accept a silent defeat. She would still try one last play. It was just a matter of time before disaster fell into her lap. Karen went home without saying anything more, but I knew that didn't mean she had given up. If there was anything predictable about her, it was that she would always try to come out on top, even if it meant twisting facts and playing the victim. So while I waited for her next move, I decided to get ahead of her. I grabbed my phone and made some strategic calls. First, I contacted one of the town's plumbers, a guy who had done some work for me in the past. I made sure to casually ask if anyone had requested an emergency supply installation in the last few days. He laughed on the other end of the line. "You won't believe it. The new woman from that property next door asked for a quote this morning." I tried not to laugh. Of course, she did. "And how much is it going to cost?" I asked, trying to sound just curious. He whistled. "A lot more than she expects, for sure. Her plumbing is old and poorly installed. Just to fix everything and connect to the city supply, she's going to spend at least around 15 grand. I was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. 15 grand. That was the kind of loss she would never have faced if she had just asked for help honestly. But the best part was yet to come. 2 hours later, one of my neighbors, an old man who had lived there for decades and knew everything that happened in the area, showed up on my property with a smirk. "Guess who's trying to spread rumors about you in town?" he said, leaning against the fence. I sighed. "Oh, let me guess. Karen?" He laughed. "She's telling everyone that you sabotaged her supply system out of revenge, that you turned her water off just because you don't like her." I crossed my arms, already expecting this kind of play. "And are people believing it?" The old man shrugged. "Most people already know her reputation, so I doubt it. But you know how it is. There's always one or two who love a bit of gossip." I was expecting this. Karen was exactly the kind of person who, instead of owning up to her mistakes, preferred to play the victim and shift the blame onto others. But she hadn't counted on one important detail. I had proof. The next day, while having coffee in town, a group of acquaintances approached my table with that curious look of wanting to know if the story they were hearing was true. I let them talk, let them tell Karen's version, and then calmly pulled out my phone and opened the photos I had taken of her makeshift connection to my piping. Funny, because if I really had cut her water off out of revenge, how would you explain this here? The group leaned in to look at the screen, and immediately their expressions changed from curiosity to shock. One of the guys, who always loved being the town gossip, let out a loud laugh. "So she was really stealing. My God, what a nerve." Another crossed his arms and shook his head. "And she's spreading that you're the villain of the story?" That woman has no shame at all. From that moment on, the tide turned against her. The gossip that Karen had been caught stealing water and then tried to flip the story began to spread faster than she could control. And the best part? I didn't even need to defend myself. People simply saw the proof and drew their own conclusion. In the following days, I saw less of Karen than usual. She didn't show up at my door anymore, didn't try to argue, didn't try to charm me into turning her water back on. That was because she was busy dealing with her own problem. The plumber I had contacted was right. Her system was a complete disaster. She couldn't just make a cheap and quick new connection. She needed to redo the entire supply infrastructure for the house, something that would cost a small fortune. And of course, now that everyone knew what she had done, no one offered to help. The silence that followed was one of the most satisfying moments I had ever experienced. For the first time since that woman moved into the property next door, she wasn't causing trouble for anyone. Maybe finally she had learned her lesson, but the cherry on top came a few weeks later. I left home early to take supplies to the shed, and as I passed the road leading to her property entrance, I saw something that made me stop the car instantly. A large wooden sign had been placed in front of the house. Property for sale. Contact for more information. I stood there for a few seconds, just soaking in the moment. Karen was leaving. Maybe she realized she wasn't welcome there. Maybe she realized that living in a rural area wasn't as easy as she imagined. Or maybe she just didn't want to deal with a neighbor who wouldn't let herself be made a fool of. The exact reason, I never found out. But the truth is, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I would never have to deal with her again. And in the end, all I needed to do was let her dig her own grave. Life after Karen was strangely peaceful. No one trying to invade my space, no worries about absurdly high water bills, and, best of all, no unbearable neighbor thinking she could take advantage of everyone. In the first few days after the "for sale" sign appeared in front of her house, I was a bit skeptical. Part of me still thought she might change her mind, perhaps try one last-ditch effort to get revenge before leaving. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that she was really moving out. The funniest thing was that as the news of the house sale spread, more neighbors started popping up to comment on it. I found out I wasn't the only one she had tried to con. One of them told me she tried to use a piece of his property as a parking space for her friends without asking permission. Another said she had already argued with a more distant farmer because he refused to lend her fuel just this once. Ledru. In other words, Karen hadn't just tried to trick me, she had been testing everyone's limits in the area. And now, after burning all her bridges, she was packing her things and leaving. It was only at that moment that I realized the big lesson in all this. Some people simply don't learn. From the beginning, Karen could have sorted everything out easily. She could have asked for help. She could have done things the right way. But she chose the path of dishonesty, thinking no one would notice, that she could keep taking advantage of others without consequences. But in the end, the consequences came. She spent a fortune fixing a problem that would never have existed if she had acted correctly from the start. She tried to shift the blame onto others and ended up only exposing her own behavior. And in the end, she lost more than money. She lost any chance of living in that community. Now, I want to know from you all, have you ever had to deal with a neighbor labeled as a Karen, someone who thinks they have rights over something that clearly doesn't belong to them? How did you handle it? Did it work out, or did the person remain unbearable? Leave your stories in the comments. I read them all and really want to know if there are more people going through these absurd situations. And of course, if you like the story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. It helps a lot and ensures you don't miss any of the upcoming epic stories coming your way. Until the next video.